My guest today is Garett Jones. He is a professor of economics at George Mason University and the author of many fine books, among them Hive Mind, 10% Less Democracy, and The Culture Transplant. Today, we talk about them all. One of our subjects is the impact of national IQ. It is actually much higher than individual IQ, even for the individual, not just at the aggregate level. We also talk about the myth of assimilation of immigrants. It's tough. Culture is very sticky. How stable is democracy under mass immigration? We also talk about trust in elites and how that impacts mass democracy. We talk about birth rate collapse as well and how that ties into discussions on immigration. And also the case for sort of colonialism light. So I think this is a very, very far reaching and very interesting conversation. It's all here. And it's not pay gated. But if you would like to support the chat, to support the community, to support me, please do go to alexkashuta.com, which is my Substack, and become part of the community to access pretty much everything I've ever done in terms of writing and recording. Or you could also go to Patreon, where there is the audio version of every podcast. Thank you so much. Every link is in the show notes. Enjoy our conversation. One of the things that has been very interesting to me in your opus has been your work on the differences between the impact of national IQs versus individual IQs. And essentially, your thesis is that national IQ is actually a bit more important than one thinks. People tend to talk about, the IQ differences between individuals and more or less spicy
Mhm.
terms, whatever that is. But why is national IQ such an important, maybe underrated variable?
Yeah, because most of the benefits of intelligence, as far as I can tell, are spillovers. They're externalities. Um, your individual IQ doesn't actually have that much of an effect on your wages. But at the same time, when I look at countries that look otherwise similar, but that differ in IQ or whatever test score you prefer, math, science, literacy, um, the effect looks quite a few times larger. My initial estimates said that they were 6 times larger. So basically, 5/6 of the benefits of intelligence accrue to those around you, not to you. So a lot of people you meet online who are big fans of intelligence scores, intelligence tests. They really want to believe that basically IQ is this huge driver of individual life outcomes. But normal estimates would suggest that IQ scores or other similar test scores might explain, say, 1/3 of income differences within a country. And as a lot of your audience knows, within country income differences just actually aren't that big compared to cross country income differences. So IQ scores in simple models explain the majority of cross country income differences. So your nation's IQ really does matter a lot more than your own. So my early work, my first 2 papers, which were co-authored with a psychologist, really nailed down the empirics of this, that what we call a stylized fact, that repeated pattern. And then the rest of my work in the area was really about trying to explain why. Why is it? Where are these external effects? Where are these externalities, these spillovers coming from? And so that really kicked off my research agenda. It took me into quite unexpected directions.
No, that's really interesting. In a way, on the individual level, that would be a very strong case for immigration, especially if you come from a lower income country, because obviously your productivity would grow potentially quite significantly if you move to a country where essentially the externalities are better.
You
Um,
want to be around people who have built great things. They help make you more productive. This is just a great lesson of life. I fortunately I was hired in an econ department where I'm around a lot of people who are smarter than me, and that's fantastic. I think it makes me better. So I think this is something like that is true for nations as a whole.
Yeah, it is really interesting because my so I currently live in Romania. This is where I'm from, but my husband is from New Zealand, and he lives with me here in Romania. And
Mhm.
it's a very kind of I love his commentary on these externalities because
Mhm.
whatever you might attribute it to culture, gene coevolution, all sorts of factors, he can really sense the difference between the Anglosphere because we met in London. That's where we both worked
Mhm.
and here. And it's
Mhm.
really interesting because there are a few variables that you highlight in your work, and I can find them to be specific here. The variables like individualism, social trust, and civic mindedness. These are exactly the pressure points with him. This is exactly what is chafing at in the local culture. I'm used to it. It doesn't really strike me as so surprising that people are less individualistic, less socially trusting, less civic mindedness, and kind of less caring about strangers here. Like it seems there's no baseline of being considerate towards strangers. People are very considerate and very kind of clannish with people within their in group. It's not even very hard to get into people's in group. You just meet over a drink and you're best buddies already. But if you're not within that circle of trust, if you're not someone who's kind of been vetted,
Mm-hmm.
it's quite yeah, it's very easy to chafe at the culture, and he does that
But
every day. So
But notice, like, so Romania is a country that's maybe has 1/3 the productivity, 1/3 the income per person as compared to the U.S. So, and that's just, so to me, that's basic. You're within spitting distance of the U.S., right? And cross-country income differences are on the order of 20 to 25x across countries. So, if all the differences in income inequality across countries were at the level of Europe versus the U.S., I wouldn't bother studying any of this. I'd just say, well, this is all rounding error. But when there's 10x, 20x differences between randomly selected countries, that's massive. Like, how can that possibly happen? We sometimes make fun of the idea that recessions could possibly be caused by people forgetting how to do things they did in the past. But there are things that are done routinely in the rich countries that are just not done in poor countries. And they tend to be complicated group tasks. And those are where the real frontier cutting edge productivity comes from. And that's just really hard to pull off in poor countries. For figuring out all the reasons for that is important. But again, 3x is like, I often say that, the global economy's B plus students get picked on a lot by the A students. And the reason why is because it's socially acceptable to pick on the B plus students. It's just not cool to pick on the D and F students. But if we're going to really understand the wealth of nations, we need to start figuring out why the global economy's D and F students are doing so poorly. And if we don't, then otherwise the popular memes online about how it's 100% colonialism or oppression or neoliberalism or something like that, those memes are just going to take off because they have the field. Everyone else is being too polite to say, here's why the poor countries are poor.
yeah, there's also a certain kind of flavor of upward mobility that countries, especially in Eastern Europe, have because they're just on the border of the West. They have certain experiences
Mm-hmm.
with the West. They know that there is certain social technology in the West that they would like to emulate. That that's
Yes.
what they're striving for. Um, but yeah, I don't know if there's like an upper bound. To this at the moment, the culture is still what it is.
I
My
mean,
husband sees it
you
on the
know,
daily.
my colleague Tyler Cowan points out that Poland just really looks like it's just on the cutting edge, right? It's just on the cusp of everyone of basically gaining mainstream recognition of being about the same GDP per capita as a lot of countries in Western Europe. Britain's gotten picked on a lot lately, and it may be the next few years that output per person or income per person in Poland, for instance, might rise to the level of might exceed that of the UK. So when I was teaching in South Korea a few years ago at GMU Korea, and that was just about the time when South Korea was overtaking Japan's GDP per capita. It's just around that period. So these sort of old memes that we have about who's behind and who's ahead. Wow, when we see the catch up growth that's happened across East and Southeast Asia and between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, some of the old rankings are just going to be flipping around.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you mentioned South Korea. South Korea is in the news for other things as well, like
Mm-hmm.
precipitous birth rate decline,
Exactly.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it is interesting, especially kind of tying into your work on immigration. I think you hear this a lot from the left. It's immigration obviously is an unalloyed good because the West is not reproducing itself. They're kind of picking up the meme of people aren't reproducing. Actually, what we need is more immigration. I mean, how does this kind of tie in with your work? Because what you have a very nuanced view on. Okay, there are downsides, especially some that are not as explicitly declared by proponents of immigration, and you kind of go into it in a very detailed way. But what do you think the impact of birth decline will be on this?
Uh, well, so the classic economic story of the effects of birth decline over time, that like the very first thing you get out of if you've taken a good intermediate macroeconomics class is, wow, that means there's going to be a lot of capital that was built up in the past that that workers in the future get to use. Um, an extreme version of this would be the fact that ancient Rome, which had maybe 1 million people at its height or so, depending on how you count the metro area, wound up with a population of say 50,000 during the worst part of the Dark Ages. So all these, just a small number of people got to wander around and be like, oh gosh, tonight I have the Colosseum to myself. That's an extreme version, right? But the lesson for a lot of us should be that population growth means that a lot of us won't be competing as much for capital. Population decline would mean that people won't be competing as much for capital because a lot of it was built up in the past. So that's actually a positive factor. People are happy to point out a lot of negative factors. I think one of the clever ones that I personally believe in is that young populations coming into a firm can kind of break up old ways of doing things and can lead to more idea growth. I'm personally pretty open to that as being important. Hoppenheim has done some theoretical work on this and with some empirical measures as well. So there's some pluses and minuses about that. We get a lot of attention focused on fiscal problems, on long-run fiscal sustainability problems. The very important idea that we need some folks to basically pay the bills that the government forgot to save for. As Milton Friedman pointed out a long time ago, insurance companies somehow never run into this problem, right? And life insurance policies basically fund themselves in a prudent long-run way, and so they don't run into these problems of saying, well, there aren't enough people around to pay for your life insurance policy. Why? Because they set aside enough money in advance. So the fiscal mistakes of the West and of all, actually, Japan's even there first, these failures to save for the future, they impose a cost on government. I think it's overblown how much that matters for overall human well-being, because for one thing, in all the rich countries I'm familiar with, the elderly are the group that's least likely to be poor. So the idea that we need to redistribute massive amounts of money morally to them, or the same amount as we have for a long time, is a little bit hard to make. Taking some reasonable cuts to the affluent poor is, I think, morally pretty justifiable. So population size per se, I think it's getting just way too much attention as a massive problem. It's worth remembering. Suppose a country's population declines 1% a year forever. You might think if it declines 1% a year forever, that means there's nobody left in 100 years. But that's not true at all. You decline by about a half in 35 years, and you decline by about another half in another 35 years. And so within a century, you'd be a fourth of what you were, which is which is a lot less, but it's not nobody. So compound declines, people don't have good intuitions for that, just like they don't have intuitions for compound growth.
Yeah, I think people don't have good intuitions for a lot of things. I wonder with this,
Especially
fiscal
things.
problems. Yeah, definitely, especially statistics and things that don't grow linearly. There's a graph that I saw going around recently on Twitter, which is essentially just the graph of the budget deficit in the U.S. I mean, as an economist, and given the birth rate decline, and do you think this spells out a grim future, or will modern monetary policy save us, or what exactly? It really, there's probably a few graphs look more like a hockey stick than that. So I wonder what you think that impact will be.
That's a great question. I just realized that I did the math wrong in my head. If you were declining 1% a year in population, you would be at about 40% of where you started off in a century. Just want to get that number right. So yeah, it's crazy that the U.S. in particular is running a deficit this big when it's booming this much. I think this is like, we're not doing what, Keynesianism would be a lot better if we did it the way Keynesian said we should do it, which is that when you're booming, you should be running surpluses or at least very, very tiny deficits. And the U.S. is running really big deficits now. I haven't paid attention to the fiscal position of the other, say, G7 countries, but I'm guessing they're about in the same boat. I know France is spending like a bunch of drunken sailors still. They're running deficits that are well above the amount supposedly allowed by the EU rules. And it's a ticking time bomb, but it's a ticking time bomb with a random explosion date. When it comes to fiscal crises, monetary crises, banking crises, all these sort of ticking time bomb scenarios, this isn't like a ticking time bomb in a movie where you know what the number is, right? It's a ticking time bomb with a random end. You're rolling a die every period. So as one great economist said, the crisis always comes later than you think, and then it's always bigger than you think. And it's totally reasonable to think that at some point, the global pool of money will just decide that one of the G7 economies is not worth lending to, or is only worth lending to if you're getting 20% interest rates. I can't tell you when that's going to happen, but it just seems very likely that people are going to look at these debts and say, are these taxpayers really up for paying this off? Come on.
Yeah.
And that's when the crisis hits, when enough bondholders think that, when enough potential investors and sovereigns think that.
Do you think that the U.S. kind of maintaining a hegemonic position on the world stage is kind of the last barrier to averting this type of crisis? And maybe a lot of this deficit, maybe not a lot of it, but a good chunk of it is related to the war in Ukraine and COVID and things like that, which essentially are kind of protective expenditure to insulate maybe not directly the U.S. hegemony, but the idea that democracy, global liberalism, globalization, all of these values are important, and we cannot let them fall, or else the whole paradigm of the West is going to flip, and then things are up for grabs, and it's a very destabilizing event.
No, I don't think that memes are gonna drive this. I think that, for instance, the war in Ukraine is costing the U.S. If we're thinking on the order of $100 billion, right? Sounds like a lot of money to normal people. It's tiny compared to the U.S. The U.S. economy is $25 trillion this year, and that's every year. So if you're talking about a war expense spread over a couple of years, it's like, this is nothing. It's amazing, like, how big a number has to be before it really moves the needle. We have to be talking Social Security expenditure numbers to start moving the needle. I tend to think that, it's U.S. people trust the U.S. Partly because it is this sort of, it does do something to create a what people call the rules-based international order, which if you're a populist, you say, well, that means the U.S. is doing a lot of things that aren't helping the U.S. To the extent that's true, right, that means that the U.S. is actually making other countries richer, like helping keep sea lanes open so that other countries' free trade agreements can work, whatnot. But beyond that, I think the real thing that makes the U.S. trustworthy, or relatively trustworthy, when it comes to sort of to international investors is because we really run a lean government, and people, compared to other countries, and people look around and say, if the U.S. ever gets into trouble, it's the country that fixes things. It has a lot of fiscal space compared to other countries. The Europeans have a mixture of high income tax rates and high VATs, and they have a lot of people. They have elderly who vote and really aren't going to stand for cutbacks. The U.S., by contrast, has no VAT, right? It has a much lower level of taxation. So if there were a real fiscal crisis, I tend to think that most of the solution really, would be a mix of cutting back on spending for the poor who vote at low rates, and creating something like a national VAT. And that by itself is enough to cut expenses and raise revenues enough to to assuage the fears of the global pool of money. On top of that, when it comes to the COVID spending, the first wave of COVID spending, the sort of Trump wave of COVID spending, that debt got inflated away. So I have to say that, like, the global pool of money was willing to take a huge hit on their long-term bonds. They basically just got nailed when, with all the inflation that kicked in the Biden era, but the seeds of it were partly planted during the COVID era. And I think that the fact that global bondholders were willing to just eat such losses on their bond portfolios, that were these inflation-driven losses, that's a sign that they're willing to lend to the U.S. in pretty crummy circumstances. So on some level, like, I never thought that bondholders would be willing to take that big a hit without pricing that risk again into the future into U.S. treasuries. But U.S. treasury rates have come right back down. People are happy to lend money getting almost no return from the U.S. So, I'm really glad that there are these people out there who feel like lending to the U.S. They're making things sustainable. I don't know which country is going to spur the fear of bondholders first, but the U.S. is probably not it. The fact that after the COVID inflation, which hurt bondholders, that that they're not frightened of lending to the U.S., that's a weirdly positive sign for America.
Yeah, I think it's always good to look at potential investments in comparison to other potential investments. And I think the U.S. in many ways, with all of whatever political division and everything that's in the news all the time, is in
Yeah.
comparison to other places still the safest investment. So I think as long as
Yeah,
that holds, it's
yeah, the
going to be
meme
safe.
about cleanest dirty shirt works a lot. I mean, I think, Switzerland, Japan, those countries, they got through COVID with lower inflation and they gave better returns to their bondholders. But still, people aren't saying, oh, wow, the Swiss franc, that's going to be the next global money because they got their act together. There's something about
Yeah,
America's scope that makes people trust it. The combination of scope and moderate competence.
yeah, just the dynamism. And I think also the kind of the cultural hegemony that just even the memes all point towards the U.S. Positive, negative, they all kind of that's kind of the black hole that sucks up
You
everything.
can't not talk about them.
Um,
I mean, the fact that people are inventing wild conspiracy theories to explain the persistence of American excellence is another strange piece of evidence in favor of America.
I mean, the fact that some random woman in Romania is having all these, as a podcast about what is essentially American culture, tells you a little bit about how interesting it is. It's not about Romanian local elections, which I would probably never be very, very knowledgeable about. I wonder what you think about the research on smart fractions.
Uh huh.
Because when you have a country like, for example, Israel, I think in general has a comparable IQ on average with a country like Romania. But in terms
Hmm.
of innovation, patents, just general output into the innovation economy, it is very much outsized. It punches above its weight. And the general explanation for that is that they have kind of this Ashkenazi smart fraction, which is not the same as the whole population. Whole population, Sephardim, all sorts of people who come from other kind of gene pools or cultures, whatever one wants to relate that to. So what do you think? How does that relate to your argument about national IQ?
I've never thought that the smart fraction theory needed to be a big part of the explanation if I'm trying to explain the wealth of nations. The early folks who online who were discussing this smart fraction story, the idea that basically what matters is not the intelligence of your average person, but the intelligence of like the top 5% of your people or top 10%, whatever number you want to go to. Um, that that story was built partly on noticing that the relationship between average IQ and a nation's income per capita was exponential. It's very clearly exponential. So if you're looking for an equation, it'd be like output per person is basically e to the 0.06 IQ. That's just to throw a little math out. And so to some people look at a relationship and see it's exponential, and they're like, well, okay, it is true as a matter of statistics that a smart fraction story would fit that. But economists have been studying the wealth of nations for a really long time. And one thing we know is that almost all of the relationships relating to GDP per capita are exponential. That's why we take logs of GDP in almost all of our statistical analyses. Because when you take a log, you turn something that's in the level and make it look more like a percentage change. So that's why I can say something like one IQ point predicts 6% higher GDP per capita. It's because the real relationship between IQ and income per person is exponential. So the smart fraction theory started off, I think, as a solution in search of a problem. It's very easy for economists to explain why a lot of relationships should be exponential, multiplicative. A particular, like a lot of our relationships in economics just naturally turn out to be multiplicative. If you double the money supply, you don't add $10 to the prices, you double the prices. So doubling the money supply doubles the prices. So multiplication is the natural way to think about macroeconomic relationships. And we keep finding again and again that a lot of our relationships, like the link between education, a year of education raises somebody's wages by about 9%, not by $9 or $900, by 9%. So our natural relationships tend to be percentage based. So the smart fraction theory was kicked off as a solution in search of a problem. When there are horse races between the two statistically in cross-country comparisons, things do tilt a little bit toward the smart fraction story, but the evidence for that mostly rests on a handful of countries. And let me tell you what those countries are. It's South Africa and the Gulf states. So South Africa has a smart fraction, predominantly, but not all, of European background. And they sort of stretch when you look at the mean. You look at the mean test score performance in South Africa. That's pretty low. But you look at the top 10%, you're like, no, it's pretty good. And South Africa is a pretty, outperforms its neighbors definitely, as many people have noted. Similarly, the Gulf states do the same thing. And that what they have mostly an imported economic elite that runs a lot of things. And sometimes they do technical stuff, sometimes they do banking, sometimes engineering. And those folks tend to outperform the average person whose ancestors came from the region, on average. So the exceptions to my point of view, which is that mean IQ matters more than the smart fraction. The exceptions to the rule are South Africa and a few oil autocracies. Those autocracies, as you'll notice, are not democracies. I have a pretty strong view personally that in democracies, the average person has a big effect on the outcomes. Not overwhelming, but a big effect. I think that's one reason we should think that average IQ matters more for the wealth of nations than elite IQ, than the smart fraction theory in the vast majority of cases. You're right. Like Israel's a cool, interesting example. I haven't actually looked at them as to see how big of an outlier they are compared to, say, Romania. But there are a lot of run-of-the-mill exceptions to the rule. But the big ones that make smart fraction look good are oil autocracies, South Africa. I don't think that they're basically models for the rest of the world to emulate in terms of income per person.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a theory based on some gems, some definite outliers just in the structure of these nations. Like this isn't your
Yeah,
average Baltic state.
and it's worth pointing out that when you do a cross country comparison, the two numbers, like the intelligence of your top 10% and the intelligence of your average person, are almost perfectly correlated. And in situations like this, formal statistical methods aren't going to help you sort out the problem. They're not going to answer your question. That's known as the collinearity problem. And that's why I'm willing to sort of engage in just kind of look at it, look at the exceptions, and ask if there are structural differences, deeper explanations that this. And when you say like a whole bunch of them are, once you realize a whole bunch of them are oil autocracies, you're like, yeah, I'm sure the smart fraction can matter if you get the right dictator. That's definitely true.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, especially people concerned about birth rates and stuff, kind of cling on to this smart fraction lifeboat to say, okay, if there are kind of subgroups that are also high in intelligence, also decide for whatever probably theological reason to procreate a bit more, that the kind of it can be a bit of a life raft for everyone else if the smart fraction really does have such an outsized impact. But yeah, this is kind of people really being very apocalyptic about the birth decline. So it's not everyone, but it seems like the light at the end of the tunnel for some. Yeah, I don't have a opinion either way, but it's an interesting kind of statistical
Yeah.
artifact.
I think if people apply smart fraction to autocracies, it'll be a better fit. I think if they just start looking around that way, they'll say, yeah, smart fraction stuff doesn't really apply that well to democracies. It works a lot better for autocracies and or monarchies, however you want to think of them. I put them in the same bin. But most of us think about wanting to live in something like a democracy, what we call democracy, these representative democracies. And I personally, my sort of if I want to go galaxy brain on it, I'd say, I actually don't think the mean literally is the person who matters the most. It's probably somebody at the 70th percentile. I think there is a lot of evidence that sort of a moderate elite, people who are sort of engaged, people who kind of keep track of the news and talk and might occasionally donate to political forces. Those tend to be a slightly more elite selected group. Those people, the top 30% probably matters more. So I might believe in a moderate version of smart fraction going forward. But the top five, no, I don't. I think in democracies, there's a lot. Politicians really respond to the masses, and that might not mean that they respond to 99% of the masses or 95% of the masses, but it's a good chunk of the masses. That's who they're fighting for when they're campaigning.
Yeah, there's a kind of an interesting effect that I've noticed here in Eastern Europe, particularly in Romania, because this is what I know best. The influence of both NATO and especially the European Union, which we kind of fought hard to get into. There's been a lot of
Yeah,
drawbacks, but I think overall, it has had a quite a positive effect, especially on kind of diffusing some of the really iron kind of prisoner's dilemma type situations that we had here, especially related to corruption. It's incredible how fast. I mean, I'm in the west of the country. It's slightly better here than it is in the south of the country. But the closer you are to the west, and the more influence you have from the organs of the European Union, which are imperfect. Obviously, they're
Sure.
essentially bureaucrats from Brussels. But there is a certain guideline and the observation of a super organism that really kind of allowed people to step into line on a lot of these things. Like the amount of corruption that I witnessed when I was growing up it was just staggering. Everything,
Hmm.
everything was
Yeah, I've
was
heard the
either a
stories from
gift
my
or
students.
money.
So yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so essentially, and now I remember when my first boy was born, and I gave birth in a local hospital here. My mother was, pacing around outside of the birthing room to hand her pile of money to someone, and she kept shoving her pile of money to, the nurses, the doctor. They were all like, "No, no, 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 no," and she was just so bewildered because she hadn't had,
Things have changed.
interactions with. Yeah, things have really, really
Yeah.
changed. And it
And that's
really,
in
it
a way
really is
that's an
people.
important way of her showing that she loved you, right? That she
Of
wanted to
course.
make sure that
I
you got the very best care imaginable, and that she was sending that signal to the people, because that was the culture she grew up in, and that's a culture that many of our ancestors grew up in. I'd say all of our ancestors must have grown up on that at some level, right? So
Yeah, and
yeah.
it's a very hard culture to break out of because if you're one person trying to break out of this culture, you're essentially a sucker. You're not going to be
No,
around for
exactly.
long. Yeah,
But it's
so so you
amazing that
continue.
the tedious EU bureaucrats were the people who were able to break this cycle. It's like, I really think, I in my book 10% Less Democracy, I have like a chapter about the I call it the hard case of the European Union. But really, I mean, it's amazing that the evidence suggests that basically when countries, as you live through this, when countries are getting ready to join the EU, it's almost like they treat the EU as sort of like the management consultant they bring in to tell them what they wanted to do anyway, right? And it turns out this is a management consultant who says like 2/3 of the advice is good, and 1/3 of the advice is a bunch of whiny namby pamby stuff that just just put up with it. Okay, I'm not gonna be able to call this stuff olive oil anymore because it wasn't pressed the right way. Um, and it's countries do seem to get their act together on these libertarian economic freedom indexes, especially in the lead up to joining. Right? It's like they have to go to the gym in order to join the EU. They have to get buff for the EU to accept them and get their act together, and it seems to work on average. And I could imagine things better than the EU, but good heavens, I've seen a lot of things worse.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of a spicy territory, but for a lot of countries, if for a country like Romania, this is essentially kind of a colonialism light, where
Hmm.
you have this faceless, nameless management consultancy coming in and just observing what you do, and you're going to get cash prizes if you actually implement the stuff that they check for, even imperfectly, because Romania doesn't really correspond to many of the things that one needs to be in the European Union, but they let us in anyway. It's there might be kind of a very almost homeopathic dose of colonialism that some countries just need to kind of
Yeah,
prop themselves up to break the stalemate of these defect effect equilibria that they're stuck in. People sometimes just want someone to say, you can be honest, you can be fair, because I think a lot of people realize that there's profit to be made. There's good things happen in a
yeah,
place where you can actually
exactly.
be an entrepreneur.
Yeah, the U.S. had that same form of soft colonialism, but often a hard colonialism, right? The New England was super productive, and it took, like, after the Civil War, the gap between rich and poor countries was rich and poor states in the U.S. was 7x, right? 7x, and now it's like maybe 2x. And a lot of that happened because the North won the Civil War, and they imposed these national rules, which were basically kind of a whole lot of capitalism um, on the rest of the country. Part of that was imposed at the point of the gun, at the point of a bayonet, literally in the 8 years of Reconstruction, and then in a softer form through a bunch of legal stuff as the post-Civil War constitutional amendments kicked in. Um, but and the states worked out a uniform commercial code. But basically, New England imposing its values on the rest of America was something that took a really long time, and I'm really glad they did it. I have to say that another in culture transplant angle here, the German migrants ultimately did a lot too to sort of bring the best values of German governance to the U.S. as well. So you have this mixture of English folks and this huge, actually, depending on who's measuring, there may be as many people of German American descent as there are English American descent now in the U.S. And together, they basically built a national culture that was super capitalist friendly, pretty low corruption, and quite universal. I mean, the South was just a different place in the late 1800s. Reading a Faulkner novel is probably the easiest way for most people to get at this. But the poverty levels, I mean, in the 1960s, there were a couple of states in the U.S. where less than half of people had like real bathrooms. Toilets, like indoor toilets, pretty rare, right? So, and that's at the same time where California had 90% of the bathrooms were full bathrooms. So like there's this massive cross-country inequality, and some form of soft imperialism was important in getting rid of that.
Yeah, you see that quite a lot here in Eastern Europe because it's all very much a patchwork of different empires having, territories and then leaving them. And Romania essentially kind of has a southern region, which is slightly more underdeveloped, except for Bucharest, which is kind of the capital, has a hub around it. And then the northwestern region where I am, where that used to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it's very visible. Its architecture, its institutions as well, and the way things are administration. So and also in the percentage of Germans, I am German as well, so that's part of it. And in Romania as well, like the president, German extraction. It's quite a very small population compared to but it is kind of a model minority within the country. And I mean, they've been here for hundreds of years. It's not, these are not new
Something similar
additions,
with Poland is going on in Poland right now too. The way you pronounced Bucharest there is something I hadn't heard before, and it's going to be one of my takeaways from this podcast. So thank you.
I don't know
Like
how
vowel
did I pronounce
pronunciation
Bucharest?
and like accurate vowel
No,
pronunciation is one of these little linguistic things I like noticing. That
no, it's actually the way they would pronounce it. I would pronounce it in Romania would be București. București.
okay, Boo.
Yeah, yeah. It's
So
just
it's sort of
me
soft B.
butchering the English language.
Yeah,
No,
okay.
it's yeah, it is really interesting. There's always all these like semi-ethnic tensions, even though we're one nation. We speak the
Mm-hmm.
same language, but they're very kind of different ethnicities within. Like the Bucharest region is part of the Balkans. Above the mountain chain of Transylvania, we don't really consider ourselves part of the Balkans. So that's kind of the big difference. We're more of like, we'd say, closer to Hungary, closer to Czech Republic, kind of a more Central European. So at least that's what people like to think.
The downside is that you don't get any oceanside resorts, right?
Oh no,
Seaside resorts. Yeah.
that's a big downside. The
One
closest
of the plus of being a
sea, I
Balkan.
think,
Yeah.
yeah, the closest sea is Croatia, actually, from my house. So
Mm-hmm.
that's about a 10-hour drive.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
is about 12 hours to our local sea, the Black Sea. But yeah, it's terrible, terrible roads. I wanted to go into also the culture transplant and your thesis that the cultures are sticky, and um, obviously, immigration is essentially at the cornerstone of a lot of discussions in politics nowadays, on the left, on the right. It is a pressure point. So why do you believe that cultures and kind of the cultures of the country of origin are so important?
Oh, I mean, it's because ultimately, like the subtitle says, migrants make the economies they move to a lot like the ones they left. People do carry values from their old country to their new one and pass it on for at least a couple generations. And the mechanisms at work are unclear, right? We can't test it. So this is, in a way, my most empirical book, where I'm here to lay out the stylized facts and to say these are super robust. A whole bunch of people found these things. People just crank out papers showing these culture transplant effects all the time on different issues. It doesn't happen on every issue. Of course, in most countries, second, third generation migrants all learn the language, right? So my book doesn't care at all about whether people learn the language. But it turns out you can predict a person's savings rate of a second or third generation migrant from a country by knowing what the savings rate is at the country back home, right? So savings rates is something that, economics says that matters, right? Having people who are frugal is good for a country. Frugality is a signal of foresightedness, of planning for the morrow, of giving thought for the morrow, and that's good. And people differ in that skill. And we know from a lot of microeconomics that people differ. It turns out that culture is one way in which people differ in their attitudes toward frugality. People who come from high savings rate countries, when they move to new places, they're bringing that frugality, and that's helping build up the capital stock in the place they move. I picked that because it's such an easy one to talk about. It's so obvious to people. It shows up. The question that got studied most was trust. Like in answer to the question, can you mostly trust other people, or usually can't you be too careful when dealing with others? That's been studied a lot, partly because both economists, sociologists, political scientists all like writing papers on it. I don't think it's the most important one, but it's the most studied. And there it's been found to the fourth generation in the U.S. That a lot of this attitude toward trust, maybe half, roughly, a little less than half, comes from the home country and kind of sticks around. So, Swedish Americans are a lot like Swedes in Sweden. Italian Americans are kind of like Italians in Italy. Mexican Americans are kind of like Mexicans in Mexico. Sort of, right? There's two-way convergence. But to the extent that there is assimilation, we should probably think that assimilation is usually a two-way street. Migrants change the places they move to. We know this is obviously true in the case of, say, like ethnic foods, but it's got to be going on in a lot of other places as well. It's been studied in some cases. It's sort of speculation in other areas. But culture transplants are everywhere, and you should definitely, when you're choosing an immigration policy, you should try to import values that your country needs more of.
Yeah, I think this is obviously a kind of a spicy hypothesis for policy. Have you seen? I mean, the book has been out for about 2 years now. Have you seen any sort of adoption or interest or opening up to this kind of line of arguments? Because it feels like very black and white the way immigration's described. Maybe it's just because of polarization between left and right, but it's like, yes, immigration, no immigration. What you bring in is quite a lot of nuance. I mean, if you were to just kind of ask me offhand, is it important where the people come from? Yes, I would say yes, it's very much important. But this seems to be like anathema to the discussion. But do you see kind of a bit more of an opening up of the yeah, just the conversation around it? Are policymakers prepared to talk about it in these terms?
I haven't seen actual policymakers, though. I was really happy to talk about, say, my general topic, or talk about cultural transplant stuff in sort of policy speeches or even their speculations. But I was really happy just a few months ago to see that the Center for Policy Studies in the UK, which was a think tank founded by Margaret Thatcher, co-founded by her, they put out a paper on immigration that actually mentioned my work along the way and talked about culture transplant effects and how that should be integrated into good immigration policy. So I do think that this will keep happening. The fact that a lot of intellectuals like talking about these culture transplant issues in a way that wasn't going on 10 years ago. I don't know if I just had good timing or whether I helped create this, but I do see both the continuing academic wave of people writing these culture transplant papers, so they're not scared off by political correctness, and pundits talking about it. And pundits are upstream of think tanks, and think tanks are upstream of politicians on a lot of these issues. So maybe it's another decade before we start seeing countries, politicians talking in the parliament about how we need to bring in people who will save more so we can boost our national savings rate. Maybe 10 years is the right window for that.
I hope so. It just reminded me of the fact that when I was in college, because I studied economics in Vienna at the Vienna University of Economics, and not to be confused with the Austrian School of Economics, which was
Sure.
barely mentioned.
Very different.
Vienna School of Economics.
Vienna's a great city.
It is a great city, but very much like a Keynesian type program that we went through. I remember we used to learn quite a lot about cross-cultural differences, world value surveys, data, the Hofstadter dimensions, things like that. But always very much kind of ring-fenced by business communication courses. It was all about, learn about your Japanese business partner, this is kind of how the cultures differ. But it never bled into kind of a bit more of a macro perspective, or it never bled into everything was very kind of siloed.
But the thing is, the World Values Survey is central to all this culture transplant research, to a lot of it at least, a certain strand of it. Because what researchers do is they take the World Values Survey answers where they ask the same questions of people in many, many countries around the world. Just for the audience, it'll be this trust question, or questions like, do you think that people should is it good to try to hire members of your family when you're at work, or should you try to hire the best person? Questions like this. And a lot of questions about values. There are a few questions about frugality, about savings behavior. And but then you compare the answers to those questions to people of that ancestry who live in your country. So you can ask, like I said before, you can ask Swedish American, you can look at the Swedish American response to the same questions. It could be on the World Value Survey or one of these other surveys. And then you look at the response of Swedes in Sweden to those questions. So the World Value Survey is central to this stuff, because a lot of, so some surveys ask people, like the best ones ask people, where were your parents born? So there's this one American retirement study that asks people, how much have you saved for retirement this year? And oh, by the way, where were your parents born? And then you can compare that to like World Value Survey questions about frugality in those countries. And it's just a paper mill. People could just crank out papers all the time, and it replicates well. It's really great. I'm really glad the World Value Study people are out there continuing this project. It really makes it easy for us to understand, A, values differ across countries in important ways, B, those values get imported when migrants move to new places. At least half. Half on average, I'll say.
Another interesting thesis that you have is about democracy and about the role of elites. I think what I see nowadays, and this is probably not new. This is the French Revolution kind of rings like this, but people do not trust elites. They are kind of very negatively inclined, both on the left, on the right. Maybe different types of elites. Pedophile cabal on the right, and international finance on the left. But the people at the top are viewed with a lot of suspicion. Do you think that affects the potential of having more elite led governments, of embedding technocracy a little bit more, especially with kind of COVID and a lot of things that have happened recently, and very high profile things? People have lost a little bit of their trust, not only just in the cabal that runs the world, but in the idea of the expert class running things. People think that it's just not been, many things have not been managed correctly. So do you think that's a problem looking forward, or this is just more of the same?
Well, the masses contain multitudes. So some parts of the masses really hated COVID policy because they thought it was too tough. Other parts of the masses hated COVID policy because they thought it was too weak. And because we're all in our little intellectual silos, we don't notice that, like, there's a huge chunk of the masses. In the US, that'll be tens of millions of people who they think they're part of they represent the true people. And they're people you've just never met online, except for seeing their craziest tweets get screenshotted. So for instance, here's my favorite example of this. Everyone in my orbit of the world was sure that wearing masks on airplanes in 2022 was just absolutely ridiculous. Like, what on earth are we doing here? And so obviously this was an elite thing pushed on the masses. Turns out if you just looked at repeated normal polls, they said the majority of people wanted people to wear masks on airplanes. Here's another fact that's important to know. The average American does not fly on a plane in a given year. So people think about airplanes as like, the average American thinks about an airplane as like something they hardly ever go on. So those of us online who were sure that the masses were all in agreement that airplane masking was ridiculous, we were all just talking to ourselves, and we're all 25,000 mile a year flyers. We're part of the elite, we just don't know it. So it's worth remembering that, like, comparing the real elites to the real masses is a lot of what I do in 10% Less Democracy. I compare real public opinion polls to what actual elites think. My colleague Brian Kaplan did an even better version of this book in his excellent book, The Myth of the Rational Voter, which I think is great, and I think more people should read it. I'm happy to talk about how the masses screw up, but we have evidence showing, for instance, that central banks run by elites that are kept apart from democracy are less likely to have banking crises, financial crises, than central banks that are run by the masses. Why? I mean, the answer is kind of obvious, which is that the masses are always like, hey, lend to my friend. Hey, lend to my friend. Hey, lend, lend, lend. And that's how you get bubbles that are unsustainable and lead to crashes. So there are a lot of reasons to complain about the elites. But, the line that Churchill never actually said is totally true, which is that the best argument against democracy is a good 20-minute conversation with the average voter. But that's, we got to come. I write non-utopian books. All of my books are non-utopian, and they give non-utopian policy advice. And so I compare actually existing elites against actually existing masses. I wish the elites would get their act together so they could sell themselves better to the masses, which is in line with what you're suggesting. But good heavens, just go meet the actual masses, not just your five favorite people you follow on Twitter.
Yes, it's I think a lot of the problem with democracy in general, especially now under kind of mass media and essentially this whole new paradigm of politics to sports, and people engaging with it in such a like intimate way, it becomes kind of their total identity. Is that it really doesn't feel like it's sustainable, because it is kind of self-consuming, like you said. People constantly pressure government for handouts, sinecures, any sort of thing. Like at one point, that kind of equilibrium has to break somewhere. Maybe you see it in the fiscal deficit, which is essentially kind of a measure of people
Mm-hmm.
making these demands and getting them. But yes, I really want to, because a lot of what's the discourse, especially kind of on the right wing, is planning, is speculating about what's next, because democracy really, like, prima facie, looks very wobbly at the moment, and especially with the kind of the impact of immigration as well, which seems to be a bit of a runaway phenomenon now, and it doesn't seem like there's any sort of cap on it. I mean, what do you make of the near to medium term future of democracy in the West?
Well, I do think. Well, for one thing, I think parliamentary democracy is a very strong default for organizing human behavior. Um, it's a way of sort of getting people who kind of represent the masses into a room and getting them to hammer out deals that might stick for a few years. That equilibrium, which has been tested for centuries, seems to be something we keep coming back to, and the alternatives to it are pretty crummy. So that's my first story. My second story is, without telling I will skip the opportunity to basically sum up my whole book, 10% Less Democracy. Instead, I will talk about this, how immigration will probably be affecting democracy. Ethnic diversity is a tax on negotiation on average. It makes it harder to come to deals when you're dealing with people who are more diverse. Ethnic diversity isn't the only kind of diversity that matters. Obviously, religious diversity, sex diversity, these things matter a lot in real life. There was a time when it would have been totally obvious to everyone in Europe that religious diversity was a huge barrier to good governance, right? And people fought incredibly bloody wars over theological debates that very few Americans could even describe halfway accurately. Now the conflict is ethnic conflict, sometimes overlapping with religious conflict. Muslim immigration in Europe has created some cultural conflict. And these are basically taxes on negotiation. And what democratic law writing is about is the process of coming to some kind of compromise that gets not just 51% of the vote, but something like 60, 70% to get a stable coalition going forward. Like, broad agreement is tough to come to, and the more diverse your coalition has to be, the tougher it is going to be to come up with quality political agreements. I think it's just obvious that this is going to be a tax. Maybe there'll be other things pushing the other way. Maybe people get more educated, or we get enough woke training in elementary school so we're all nicer to each other. Maybe that'll reduce these costs. This is speculative, right? But we do know that coming to democratic negotiations is really hard, and coming to democratic negotiations with a diverse coalition is even harder. So I expect a sort of mild increase in the tax ramping up over time and it becoming more and more obvious.
And I guess because of these pressures, 10% less democracy will seem like a good way of alleviating these transaction costs.
Yeah, I mean, I
Maybe.
think that's part of it is that you outsource some of these problems to people who are a little bit further away from from the voters, whether it's Supreme Courts or central banks or maybe a fiscal commission that'll make your tough financial decisions about settling the accounts for the elderly. Um, these various tools of just kicking the can down the road so that the parliament can be more of like a place for venting and less of a place where the deals have to be made in real time, especially hammering out the details of the deals. Because the devil is often in the details, and outsourcing that to some elites who might do their own corrupt things, but my gosh, keeping it out of the forum of parliament might make it a lot easier to come to some kind of a deal. Sometimes it really is the case that in democracies, especially rich democracies, half a loaf can be so much better than none that it's worth baking a lot of loaves.
Yeah, I'm thinking about there've been a lot of debates about the composition of the team that we sent to the European Parliament from Romania, and a lot of these people are elites, maybe in the sense that they've made a lot of money, but they're not necessarily people that I would trust in making kind of very detailed decisions. I mean, um, there's probably better ways to organize this, but you think this is essentially just a default because it's the it's the tried and true way that people tend to delegate their votes, and it's better than complete non-elites participating in this. But I just know that like the selection effects here are not necessarily for intelligence qualifications capabilities. They're just someone's famous, I guess, and then they
You
go
know,
to the European Parliament.
I don't know what about the precise Romanian situation, but I do know a lot of European elections, including these parliamentary elections, are proportional representation. And I left proportional representation out of my book, but I've thought about it a lot. I mean, and one of my vibes, I don't have hard evidence on this, but one of my vibes-based feels about democracy is that district-based elections lead to politicians who are much more like, they're not more normal, but they understand their voters better and they represent their voters better than these parliamentary list-based kind of things where you basically vote for a party and then they hire so many people down the list, and the negotiation of who got on the list is due to a bunch of shenanigans that went on behind the scenes. These district-based elections lead to a kind of democracy that just feels more representative. You have to know, the person who gets elected has to know something about the 100,000 or 500,000 or 50,000 people in that district. And I think that gets you more representation. And they have more of a model in their head of that politician has a better model in their head of what his job is and that model. Well, it's not that he has a better model of what his job is. He has just as good a model, but the model includes paying attention to real people back home. It won't be,
Yeah, no.
it's not utopian, but it's, I think, more like representation than the PR system. Again, PR systems work fine. I can't find any really great evidence against it, but I have a hunch that in a world of rising, if diversity continues to become a continuing and rising problem in Western democracies, then I think the representative district-based democracies will start looking better.
Yeah, I think what I'm chafing at is probably the fact that these people actually are representative of the 100,000 people that they went to represent. So yeah, I think that
Yeah,
the fact
that's
that they
interesting.
do
Okay.
mirror. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
you
I've
yeah.
a lot of these. Look at a lot of these people in the House of Representatives, and a lot of them are like they're like used car dealers and people who ran parking lots. And you might say, oh, these people are fake, they're phony, they're kind of they have the same fakeness as like realtors or something, but they're not even they're less charismatic. The problem is that if you're running a parking lot, if you're running a used car shop, you really have to know something about people, and you have to build a lot of
Exactly.
relationships. You have to like the skill of getting along with masses of people is not a natural skill, right? It's a very unnatural thing. It's not that, if you're into ev psych or whatever, you're not going to say that the ability to sort of please 150,000 people is not something that our ancestral environment trained us for, right? And at the same time, I don't know how many politicians you've met. I haven't met a lot myself, but yes, I've worked in the Senate. Um, but when you talk to people who've met a lot of elite politicians, they often say that this person had just some kind of strange charisma. I've heard this so many times. So I've seen a little bit of it up close. I felt it a little bit. But they have something that is quite unusual. I have to imagine Caesar must have had a version of this. that could just win people over by his personal presence. And it's something that wins people over that's a much larger group than the so-called ancestral band or a Dunbar's Law number or whatever psych meme you're going for. The ability to please hundreds of thousands, to halfway please hundreds of thousands of people is an unnatural act. And I'm glad we can pull it off.
Yeah, it is interesting. Some might speculate that it's been planted by aliens or something because we didn't need it in the ancestral environment. It's
Yeah,
completely exogenous.
the ability to, but I think, I mean, on some level, it's got to be some kind of outgrowth of the rise of the ability to generalize, the ability to the abstraction ability that's central to human intelligence has to be related to this in some way. I'm speculating. I'm here speculating, but there's the ability to please many has to be some sort of lowest common denominator sort of a model that sticks as a meme in somebody's head.
Yeah, I guess if you can do it in the on the one-to-one, there's probably some kind of charm that you can leverage, especially now with mass
Yeah,
media. And it also, all of this, one-to-one charm also has externalities. People talk, people, you become kind of a node in a network, and that's kind of how a lot of this clout is built. You do a few favors are done for you. At least that's how it
yeah,
works here in Eastern Europe. But I guess that's generalizable. Um, I know
yeah. I
we're
guess
coming up on time here. Yeah,
sure,
yeah,
sure. No, I
continue.
just wanted to say, the Jungian archetype is what I'm thinking of. The idea that there are these archetypes that are probably floating around in our minds, and certain individuals tap into them in a way that is incredibly infectious. That seems to be what's powerful and rare, and it's a human condition, I think.
Yeah, no, that's a great observation. Yeah, there is some kind of heroic leader-like element. People do like it's instinctive. They do like to align behind someone.
Yeah.
There's this kind of um they absolve a certain burden of self-consciousness when you have someone
Mm-hmm.
you feel like you can trust, and then it's very relaxing to be in the presence of a leader.
And if
Finally.
I'm gonna be a lazy, if I'm gonna be a pretend evolutionary psychologist, I'd say that solving those focal point problems, which is a game theoretic idea, can really be crucial for productivity. Like just saying we're all deciding to follow this person into battle is, even if that person isn't perfect, is better than us each picking 10 different leaders who we each think are good and disagreeing on who that person is. Sometimes just picking a leader can solve a big coordination problem and solve a big productivity problem. So it's that again, that's something that's a part of the human condition. It's something that powerful minds open up. It's an option that powerful minds open up, and figuring out how productivity is linked to the ability to collaborate is sort of something I've wrestled with for decades now. And I hope that a younger generation starts taking the flag and carrying it forward on this question of why it is that how people come to the ability to collaborate effectively at scale, and why so many of us fail at that same task.
Yeah, and also I think what a lot of people fail at nowadays is just kind of the initial activation energy, that initiative to when you're in a scrambling group, potentially it could be you, the person who proposes the first anchor point, and then a lot of leadership is just that, just providing structure to a fuzzy or ambiguous problem, or just kind of becoming the first pylon that people can lean on to build. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I keep seeing this, and people just very kind of they're scrambling for people to provide that anchor point. But maybe it could be you, but this is all very fuzzy and speculative and off the rails. But yes, I want to ask you the last question, the question of the show.
Yes.
Do you have a recommended underrated thinker that you think would be interesting to the listeners?
Yes, I am a huge fan of Gary Miller's book, Managerial Dilemmas. It had a huge effect on my research agenda. Um, so, what Gary Miller did, he's a business professor at Washington University in St. Louis. He took a lot of these ideas of public choice or political economy that's related to what my colleagues at GMU created, and he said, politics is complicated and it's hard to get people to collaborate on projects, and people want to. Nobody wants to do the heavy lifting on a team project. Voters have a poor incentive to be informed on issues. And he applied all this to corporations. He says boards are lazy organizations for overseeing the whole corporation. We know that a lot of value in teams and corporations come from team efforts. And on any team effort, everyone has an incentive to shirk, right? How can you possibly? We have theorems that prove this, but just living in real life, it's true. And again, he came up with different applications of how incentives, the beautiful incentives of microeconomics, break down once you think about the team efforts that are crucial to corporations. And he says, every solution we're going to come up with here is so mediocre. And the only thing that can solve it, this is his big climax in the book, is good culture. And the solution to having a good culture is finding a leader who can inspire a focal point to get other people to collaborate on this strange focal point that he or she has picked. And it's a game theoretic idea that overlaps heavily with the idea of charisma as a solution to human problems. So Gary Miller's book, Managerial Dilemmas, I've recommended it to quite a few people. It's very popular in the GMU orbit. But it shows that all team projects, all corporations are political, but not in a sort of hand waving like, oh, it's just politics way, but in relationships of power are everywhere and incentives to deceive and cheat are everywhere. But somehow a few of us come up with decent solutions to this, and figuring out how to create that is central to making firms and nations more productive.
That's so fascinating, because it's essentially kind of an application of the great man of history theory or view onto economics. That in the end, it really is about the person who steps up to provide the anchor point, which is a very hopeful note to leave this on. I really want to encourage everyone to read the books, The Hive Mind, 10% Less Democracy, and The Culture Transplant. Is there anything that you're working on right now, or anything that people should know about?
I'm having a great time working with Blue Chip, which is the world's first stablecoin rating agency. What I'm doing is just applying good economics, including a lot of great GMU ideas about free banking, to this new world of stablecoins. Some we give letter grades, A through F. Actually, A plus through F, but we've never given an A plus, and we give quite a few Fs. I think that's just a great application of good economic ideas in the real world. I'm having a great time doing it. Totally unrelated to all my other books. I started off as a monetary economist in my dissertation, and fate has brought me back to that in a very applied 21st century way.
Oh, that's very cool. And I know you also have a Substack, which will be in the show notes. Any other thing that you'd like to mention? Also on Twitter, I want to mention that you are also on Twitter.
Yes.
I think is that everything? Have I covered everything?
The key is spelling my name with one R. If you spell my name with one R, you'll find me.
Which I did not in the initial message to you. That I just checked
No, it's common.
Today.
It's normal. If you do it with two R's, then you get the guy who played for the Yankees. He's a really nice guy. He had a great career. Then he went and played in Japan for a while. You could ask him about culture transplants. So he was one.
I might. I'm glad my misspelling didn't lead me to mistakenly get the
You would have been great
player.
on your podcast too. So
I'm sure. Yeah. Thank you so much, Garett. This was a lot of fun. I do hope we can do this again. I know your opus extends much further than we could go, but this is a lovely chat. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Alex. It was great.
If you've enjoyed this conversation and would like to support me, please do give it a like, give it a rating, give it whatever your platform of choice lets you do in terms of positive feedback for the channel. It would be very appreciated, because of previous episodes that I had. I think the juicing of the channel has been impacted severely, especially some of my COVID-related episodes. I got a few strikes on a few platforms for that. So if you could, juice the algorithm for me, I'd be very appreciative. It could even be a horrible comment. I'm used to them. But if you also would like to more directly support me and the channel and the production of this very elite show, please do go to alexkashuta.com, my Substack, which has a very cool community feature. It also includes my writing, includes every episode ever recorded of this show back to the ancient times, or to Patreon, which just includes the audio of every episode, which is patreon.com/Subversive. Thank you so much for your support. You are the people that keep the lights on.